Okay, so welcome everybody to the first SIG Telemetry working group, which is, it's SIG Telemetry over at Operate First. We moved this over from the Open Infra Labs Telemetry working group and gave it a proper name, which is called SIG Telemetry. Operate First SIG Telemetry. That's the proper name for it. You can read up on the README and the charter document on these links here. I just share it out. So the charter states that we will discuss problem statements and research that group members are performing to address them and how to evolve the environment to better support research needs. In scope are those research problems around telemetry, discussing solutions to those problem statements, and providing an access to a platform for telemetry research. And this time we have Lisa Seelye, I hope I pronounced the last name correct,
Seelye,
to present on SLOs and how to create SLOs, which are a good basis for all things telemetry. So, Lisa, why don't you take over the screen share, and after that we can have a discussion about how how SLOs can be a basis for telemetry and how to build upon that.
Alrighty. Let me see here. Getting these all set up.
It's up.
Yep. If I go forward, cool. Okay. So let's just dive right in. And thanks everyone. As Marcel mentioned, my name is Lisa Seelye, and thank everyone for coming, even the latecomers, especially the latecomers. I have a little talk on how to pick some SLOs, and going to be looking at some examples from my previous employer. And it's SLO creation in you, or how we learned to stop worrying and love queue length. Bit of a spoiler. So a little bit about myself. I'm senior SRE at Red Hat. I'm a member of a special interest group that focuses on SRE topics. And right now I'm giving my attention primarily to SLOs. And previously I worked at a company called FreshBooks, which is a small cloud accounting company based in Toronto. And that is where all of these come from. And this talk is given with permission. So as I mentioned, the story is set at a previous employer called FreshBooks. And at the time, we were just starting down the SLO path. And this is the tale of how the first ones were created. First, let's introduce the cast of characters. Up first, we have service level objectives, or SLOs. These are used to set formal expectations for your service to stakeholders. Or in other words, a way to say, we aim to provide this level of service. Almost in the same breath is the implication that the service owners are going to make efforts to restore the service to that level whenever there's a violation. Please note that this is really high level, and the longer story is much deeper than we have time for. Related to SLOs are SLAs, service level agreements. SLAs are usually written like contracts, and violating them involves paying out money and lawyers, usually. They're usually a business relationship between a customer and the business with penalties for violations. Well, those are super important. We're not going to talk about SLAs today. We're going to be focusing on SLOs. Just know that they're a bit different than SLOs, but the same vein. Next up, is RabbitMQ. RabbitMQ is a message queuing software that forms an important piece of the tech stack at FreshBooks. They used RabbitMQ to offload long-running tasks to other services in their microservice architecture so that the customers didn't have to wait in their browser for background tasks to complete an asynchronous process. You think RabbitMQ, think asynchronicity. When a customer signs up to the service for the very first time, a message goes into a queue to send an email to that customer saying, hey, welcome, here's some things you can do. It's a call to action. It helps with use RabbitMQ for data analytics and a whole host of other topics. Next is the concept of service ownership, which is an idea of moving the service health away from a dedicated ops team, sysadmin team, and giving service owners that responsibility. What's a service? Service is software that does some work for us. And more on that in a little bit. And finally, our new service owners. Those are the folks who own the service, or a team that owns the service. In Agile, those people might be the product owner or product manager, a team lead. They are the ones who are empowered to create SLOs and direct work related to their services. So with that in mind, let's dive in. In Act 1, we made an SLO. So my sysadmin team there had just started on the journey towards service ownership, where the individual teams were going to be owning their services instead of the operations service being responsible for everything. It was still an aspirational goal when I left FreshBooks, so I can't speak to where they are now, but I can share some learnings from what we learned along the way. The very first goal was to get to a place where every service has a team and an owner who are responsible for its well-being. In order to support the new service owners, my team, the operations team, used RabbitMQ as a part of their pilot program to come up with some SLOs. At the end of the pilot, we wanted to give some guidelines to everyone else to create their own SLOs. Things that we thought were important, things we thought were less important, some pitfalls to watch out for. And since the ops team wasn't working in a vacuum, we wanted to go to our RabbitMQ users to see if what we came up with was on the right track of what they expected the service to provide for them. We're all new at it, so more feedback is more good. So let's take a look at the very first SLO and how it was received. We offered 99.95% monthly availability as measured by some software that we wrote. We were really excited and talked about it inside FreshBooks. We even had some new disaster recovery objectives for the first time this year as well. But it was going to be a pretty big shock to the RabbitMQ users inside FreshBooks that we left off queue length and consumer count from our objectives. Why the shock? Because that would be a departure from what we had used to do. More on that in a little bit. I thought it best to be upfront and mention the change when sharing the new SLOs so that people weren't going to be surprised later on. The reason we left them out is that we, the operations team, didn't see queue length or consumer count as good indicators of the health of the RabbitMQ service. So why would we include them as any kind of objective? Why would we measure them at all? The RabbitMQ service owners never used the queues, so how would we make sure that we hit those objectives? And what was the reaction? We think you should have queue length as an SLO. Oh. Act 2 is all about the queue length. So at this point, there's clearly a mismatch of expectations, and it's okay when you're creating SLOs to have this kind of discussion. And to be frank, I expected it. In FreshBooks, queue length had historically been used to infer the health of RabbitMQ, since there had been a correlation between the queue length and poor FreshBooks experience for our customers. But there's a whole bunch of reasons that a queue might have a bunch of messages in it. One of them might be maybe there's not enough consumer capacity, and that is the reason why there are more and more messages in the queue. Or maybe there's been an unexpected usage spike that's going to clear on its own without any human intervention. One example here might be batch processes. At the first of the month, because FreshBooks is an accounting software, a whole bunch of messages get dumped into a queue so that they can get processed out to handle the first of the month and end of the month closures. Another possible reason, maybe a RabbitMQ customer inside of FreshBooks shipped a bug with their service that caused messages to back up somehow. Or maybe the service owners of the consumers need to start a capacity planning cycle to handle the normal growth of their service. Maybe our business is just growing and there's more demand. That's a great problem to have. And maybe they need more consumers deployed to handle the increased demand. So it looked to me like alerting on queue length wasn't ideal because there's a lot of ways for the queues to grow. Given the pushback, though, it was clear that our developer friends saw a lot of value in the queue length. So what did they see that we don't? They said when asked, well, it lets us know if we might not have enough capacity. Okay, it's reasonable. It lets us know if there's a problem with our queue service. Maybe we can't publish or consume messages. Yeah, you want to know that too. And it lets us know if RabbitMQ is well provisioned. We explore this one, and the real concern here that they wanted to make sure of was that we would take their messages as quickly as we could and give them back as equally as fast or faster. Really, they just wanted to make sure that we weren't going to cheap out and run RabbitMQ on a Raspberry Pi to save some money. Sure, it was a joke, but the point was well made. How can we assure our RabbitMQ customers that we'll enqueue their messages fast enough so that the publishing services aren't waiting to say, here's a message, here's a message, here's a message? How can we give some durability assurances that the message that they give us will be the message they get out to the other end in the correct order? With the dialogue that we added another SLO around message and queuing latency and instrumented our new monitoring software to measure it. But back to their other concerns. We can come up with more direct ways to address them if we guide the service owners in asking some questions about their services. And that's Act 3, asking some questions. Our new service owners had some questions that they didn't know how to answer, and we're instead relying on an indirect high noise way, which is the queue length, as a proxy. A shift of focus we thought would be required, and we think we can get there by asking questions centered around the key business needs. If we can answer these other questions, I'm confident that we can all see eye to eye and agree that minimizing queue length shouldn't be an SLO for the RabbitMQ service owners. There may be a natural pushback to this new way of thinking or working. It was up to us as drivers of the SLO pilot to kind of sell the new way. Remember, at the time, queue length alerts raised a flag that something might be wrong. And for some folks, that's enough. Why do all this extra work? Then here's why. When someone is paged for an alert, wouldn't it be nice for them to have a pointed reason as to why? Like, hey, you might want to know that customers over the past hour have been waiting 5 minutes longer for emails than what we expect. That's a direct call to action. That can prompt more focused investigation, like why have customers been waiting an extra 5 minutes? You get capacity planning for free. We're already going to measuring those key indicators to make sure that we're hitting our objectives. So why not use that to project growth? We know they're important indicators since they're supporting our SLOs, so it's going to save us some extra work. Like if we look back 6 months, you can see the email delivery time is slowly going up. We can project when we're going to violate our objective and act accordingly. Be more consumers, maybe load balance our email providers, and so on. So imagine I'm a service owner and you use my service. When you discover the hard way that we shut it down for 2 days a month for maintenance, I bet you wished you knew that ahead of time so that we could have talked about it. But here we are. Your service is giving me errors. We're giving errors to customers because I let you make an assumption about how reliable our service is, as well as set these expectations and can even invite room for discussions around them to see if they meet the needs. When we share our objectives, we also hold ourselves accountable by setting an expectation to management, to our development teams, to our customers, should we choose to share them outside, about that we're going to do what it takes to restore service when we have some kind of violation. Maybe that means slowing down our development velocity to fix bugs. Maybe it means doing some engineering to improve the service, or some other work as is reasonable to do. I think individual contributors also feel empowered to pay down some technical debt that stands in the way of meeting their service objectives, instead of just watching it all pile up in the corner while reliability gets worse and worse. If we keep these goals in mind, we can frame the conversation with our new service owners, because we can point to these gains and say, these are the reasons for shifting to this new way. We get all this stuff and some more stuff too. When we look back to the questions that queue length answered, we can take some of those questions and reframe them in a more direct way. Because what does enough queue workers even mean? What kind of worker problems do they have in mind? And to be clear, those aren't bad questions at all. Not at all, because they got some value out of it. But if we can tease out these underlying concerns and start asking more direct questions, we can see if a RabbitMQ can even provide the best source of truth for the answer. Digging deeper by asking questions like, why is that? What does that answer for you? We can lead new service owners to focus on the objectives that matter for them and their customers, and discover the best source of data for them. Remember that we want to be convincing with the idea that queue length isn't what they're looking for, because there's better ways to address their root questions. But first, we need to uncover what those root questions are, what keeps them up at night. It's hard to come up with a set of generic questions that can apply to every service. They do different things, but by definition, and it's going to be hard to generalize. But we can talk at a high level about some of them, though. Let's try out some old questions and then add some new ones for service owners to ask. Is my service healthy? What are some ways that we can know when our publisher or consumer aren't working? That's a very important question, and I want to answer it with another. Is RabbitMQ the best place to look for answers? An inference can be made from the queue's behavior, but remember, the goal is to have direct indicators. We have a data source here, message publishes, and consumer acts, but we don't have to use it, especially since it's low fidelity. So in turn, I would ask the service owner, what does your health check say about the health of your service? And what does the misuse of our service even look like? This is also an important question, but again, it's not one that Rabbit is best suited to answer. So we ask our new service owners, what does service misuse mean to you? What is the best source of data to detect it? Do you need to make some new data available somehow? The concept of customer wait time is pretty universal, whether you're at the bank signing up for a new web service, or signing up for a new web service. Although these days you probably can't sign up for a web service at the bank, there's going to be a waiting period before you can do anything. Maybe an account needs to get turned on. You need to click that verify your account email. For our example, we can focus on how long should a FreshBooks customer wait before getting the welcome email after signing up. It's a very important question, because if the customer waits too long, they may never convert their trial account to a paying one. So clearly this should be an objective. But how do you describe it? I'd offer, maybe for a given cohort of new signups, we'll deliver 99% of their welcome emails in under 2 minutes from the time the customer clicks the button to when it's sent off to our email partners. In 99%, you have to start somewhere. If that's not reasonable, the business folks will certainly let you know. And really what we're doing here is measuring how long a message is sitting in the queue waiting to be processed, or the time in the queue, different from the length of the queue. Without that new context of how long we should be waiting, we don't have any way to know if, say, 500,000 messages in the queue is good or bad. Because if they're being processed within our target, then we're fine. 500,000 isn't scary at all. But without that context, we have no idea if that many messages is bad. Sure sounds scary, right? 500,000, big number. We always saw keep the queue length to 0 as a proxy for minimize our customer wait time. And that's related to service throughput. And you can think of it as we should have the ability to process X messages per minute or per second or other unit of time. In other words, once we get a message from RabbitMQ, how long does us take to do our work before sending that email off to our mail partner? When the throughput drops, the customer wait time is going to go up. Okay, so now what? We have all of these new questions and maybe even an agreement that queue length isn't the best place to find answers to our questions. Like the cat in this obligatory cat picture. I wish he was mine, he's not. Aww. We have to assess the situation before pouncing on our target. For your services, what's important for your customers? What's important for your business? What data do you need to begin to answer all of those questions? Does that data exist? If not, you might need to do some engineering work to expose those relevant indicators before you can even answer those questions. And that's totally okay. Your service should change so that you can answer those questions. Just take care not to measure and alert on everything, or you might end up like us. So let's take a look back and then review our story. The approach the ops team at FreshBooks had with running RabbitMQ was largely, it's kind of a black box. It worked, but we don't really know how to get the best out of it, or to know how it's healthy, or to know when it's unhappy. We found that being unfamiliar with our tools made it hard because we didn't know what to look for. When we did have problems, we saw that the queues were long and thus made the association that long queues equals bad times. In other words, long queues were the symptom that forced the patient into the doctor's office. It wasn't the problem, but brought attention that something might be wrong. As I mentioned earlier, we had a lot of pager fatigue. Getting paged time and time again, we're inundated by alerts from RabbitMQ to the point where we literally disabled them to sleep through the night. And that fatigue really informed how hesitant I personally was to have a queue length as an objective. Imagine just getting paged over and over and over again. We got paged, I think the average was every 2 minutes. And there must be a better way because that kind of paging isn't sustainable. So what were some of the key lessons? The old ways weren't working. Page on everything and just try and figure out what the noise means. Doesn't work. Or it certainly doesn't scale. And you have to be open to having discussions with people when you're coming up with these SLOs. People might have different needs of your service than you expect. The whole catalyst for the change was the push towards service ownership. And that change took a while. At the start, it was a quiet acceptance that those noisy alerts resulted in no action. Oh, we got paged again. Okay, it's going to resolve itself soon. Now, I certainly hope that there is a new idea of going forward. And remember, just because you have a hammer doesn't mean it's the best tool to screw in nails. Just because you have a source of data doesn't mean you need to use it. If you can find a more accurate, direct source of data to measure what you care about, use that one, even if it requires some extra work. And one last thing before I wrap up. This was all about a technical topic, RabbitMQ, all that stuff. And you might get the impression that SLOs are only for software, and they're not. If you think about your most recent call to your phone or cable company, how long did you wait before talking to a human? If you can even talk to a human these days. That metric is measured and tracked, and it's used to improve the service. Well, not my phone company. And in fact, while I was at FreshBooks, had a really nice talk with the manager to put some service objectives around responding to incoming support tickets for our customers. So can be used for support. It's like everywhere I look these days, I think, oh, we could have a target around that. Could have a target around that. But nevertheless, I do hope that these give some helpful jumping off points. And if you're interested in more, I really, really recommend the Google SRE book, Chapter 4 specifically, and definitely stay tuned to Operate First /SRE, the GitHub repository. The SIG that I am a part of at Red Hat is going to be publishing a whole bunch of content in there, certainly around the topic of SLOs, but definitely not limited to the topic of SLOs. And so with that, if there's any questions, I would be more than happy to take them.
I have a quick question. So is the queue length still a service level indicator? So we still measure the queue length and the, I don't know, the congestion and other metrics, but it doesn't become an objective, right? So you still need to have those indicators for debugging reasons, but you don't want to be alerting on critical values. Oh, you're on mute.
You think I would have done this before? Yeah, you would still very likely measure the queue length because you get that for free coming out of RabbitMQ. I don't know that you would do much with it because the reasons are so many as to why it could be large. So yeah, it is likely a data point or a source of data. I don't know that you would go so far as to call it an SLI. An SLI usually is used in the context of informing the compliance or the meeting of an SLO or SLA. So that might be like just a terminology thing. Source of data, yes. Page on it, probably not.
And from an investigation point of view, so let's say I don't have any alerts or measurements or dashboards set up. Do I start with everything that the software already emits and then build upon this and figure out some SLOs, or do I really take a step back and ask myself what determines service happiness and customer happiness, and then use the metrics and the knobs and data that services and the whole stack provides?
So there's really two schools of thought here. One is that you can look to the data that you already have and say, what questions can I answer with this? And if those questions happen to line up with your business goals, then great. The other school of thought is more top-down. The other one may be bottom-up. Like, here's what I have, what can I do with it? The top-down approach might be starting with the questions and then going in search of data to answer those questions. For example, or maybe not questions so much as goals, where you can say, I want messages to sit in the queue for no more than 2 minutes. That informs a whole host of decisions, right? If your throughput is measured at, you put in 2 messages a second or 10 messages per second, your consumer part of that equation must be able to keep pace or be faster than that. So that means you may need to scale horizontally your consumers, or you may need to have one monster consumer that just is very, very fast. And that time in queue, you may also need to instrument the publishing and consuming process should your message broker not provide that for you. So I kind of come at it from the top-down approach, especially for more experienced teams. But if you're starting very new, you might get more value out of the bottom-up approach, where you say, this is the data that we have. What questions does this objectively answer for us? As a way to get started.
Okay.
So one of the things you said that was interesting, or an implication of something you said that I found interesting, was it sounds like part of what you need to have as your plan is a feedback mechanism to get it from your consumers, and consumers in this case meaning the people using your service. So that
Kind of. So that one of the tricks that you run into is that you need an objective source of data. And for a web service these days, I mean, it's almost all web services, right? If you're using Gmail in a Google's Office, you're probably going to have a much faster experience than someone on a rural farm who's using a satellite link to access, right? So that means the page is going to render at different amounts of time based on when the data, gets to where you're going, the browser can do its thing, right? So that really kind of wants to have an objective source of data that you're going to base your measurements off of, and that's a canary, sometimes called a canary or a prober. And if the model supports it, then you would have something that is going to fulfill that need. So, for example, for us, we had a publisher and a consumer that published a message every minute, every second. I can't remember what the cadence was, and then consumed it straight away. And it had measurements around that to say, oh, well, we know we published it at this time. We consumed it at this time. That means it was in the queue for, right? So it's really, as best you can, get objective measurements. And that might be native data that's coming from your application that you have instrumented, or it might be like a black box solution where you have some program that you control in a controlled environment that is interacting with the service.
Mm-hmm.
Does that help or answer?
It does.
Cool.
Thanks.
As we are being SIG Telemetry, do we care about how to get all the telemetry data? I imagine something like we have these Rick and Morty clusters here in EMEA. Then there's all the stuff on the mass open cloud. Do we need to care about how to gather all the telemetry into whatever it is? Prometheus, I guess? Or is that out of scope, you would say?
It can be out of scope. It probably is out of scope, I would say. And the reason I say that is, well, this again goes to my personal bias. As I mentioned before, I'm more of a fan of a top-down approach where we say, this is our goals. How do we get there? And that goal setting should drive engineering work if needed. So if there is no way to centralize the data or to even measure the data, then that's engineering work that needs to take place. And that's separate from the SLO itself. And in a vacuum, the SLO is the SLO. It's hopefully concise, where it says, hey, we expect it to be this, as measured by this over this time frame. And that's not really coupled to the mechanics of measuring or storing or handling the metrics. Just, it should be this.
That's why I ask in the context of the telemetry special interest group and not on the context of SLOs. Because I completely agree. You should take that whole SLO, SLA, whatever SL top down. Because ultimately we're just informing business people, right? So they don't really care about queue, blah, 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 and Kafka topics and all that shit.
Exactly.
But looking from an bottoms up point of view and looking from an infrastructure platform, operate first, we have so many clusters point of view, how do I make sure that I get all these RabbitMQ queue length measures into my whatever database? That is why I'm asking that question.
Right. So that could also be an objective in and of itself, right? So the objective could be something like, we're going to gather all the metrics from our many clusters and centralize them in this place. And the delay from the time, the lag from when they are generated to when they are scraped and end up in the centralized place could drive that engineering work.
Right.
It's also a really good question because some of the users that we expect to start having, although as we've moved over to this new format, some of them have fallen off. I expect them to rejoin once we get them connected again, are researchers. And they tend to just like to bathe in the data and figure out interesting new problem sets. And as what you said just now, Lisa, was really, really interesting because basically, we can make that an objective and the timing around it may be much more relaxed.
Yep, exactly. It could be that you don't, it's not so time sensitive. So long as the data gets there at some point, maybe you scrape it once a day or batch it down once a day, and that's totally fine. And that's kind of the sticking point you could say, where you hear all about these days, 4 nines, 5 nines. It's like, people don't really need that all the time. If it gets there and it's totally fine to be delayed a day, don't bust your butt, get it there in a day. It's very expensive to have more nines and less delay, less latency. So in terms of the telemetry, that's kind of where the intersecting, where the SLOs intersect the engineering work, the instrumentation of software or other things, is where we need to have really high fidelity signals and have a way to get the data out. And if we can't do that, how can we ever know that we're winning? And that's really what it's all about, is to know if you're winning, know if your customers are happy.
I have questions that are not directly related to the SLOs, but I want to pause with those until other folks have asked more SLO questions, if they have them. No? So a thing that I was curious about, you mentioned the SRE training stuff. I had a discussion with Karsten Wade last week about, so I work with the Mass Open Cloud Alliance. And so one of the things that a lot of the folks involved in that who are not at Red Hat have voiced an interest in is the open source SRE training work that you guys are going to be working on. It sounded from my discussion with Karsten last week like this is probably the right time to begin reaching out to them and saying, are there people who would be interested in helping to build a community around this? I just wanted to double check and make sure I had the right place to point them at in terms of GitHub. And any other feedback that you guys have that I should include in whatever I'm saying to them as I reach out.
Yes, I think, so for folks inside Red Hat, I know there's stuff for Red Hat University or Red Hat U that we're involved in. I don't know how much of that is going to be published outside of Red Hat, but for the SRE SIG I'm a part of, we're going to be publishing our stuff to operate first, and that GitHub repository is where the stuff is going to go. We don't have I don't think we have a proper landing page yet for us, but the GitHub repository will certainly be one of the places to consume that stuff.
Okay. Does it, from your perspective, does it feel like it's reasonable to start reaching out to try and build that community, or is it a little bit further out?
I don't know if it's ever really a bad time, right? If you get,
It's sort of if they show up but there's nobody to greet them kind of thing. It's that, like, if you guys are so focused on
right, okay,
being knocked on.
right, you're right. I see now. No, I think it might be a little premature for that. Right now, I think what people would see is a lot of pull requests flying back and forth, and that might, that might be fine for some people who like to see how the sausage is made, but for normal people who who aren't into that sort of thing, that's probably not so helpful as the finished thing.
Okay. So the folks I'm thinking of are developers by background. So I'll reach out to them with the context of, we talked about this a year ago. It's now getting to the place where it might make sense to start looking at it. They're not necessarily ready, but if you want to see the pull requests going on to start to see it, then here's a place to look. Like I'll give them a reasonable expectation.
Michael, is that researchers who are trying to learn to become SREs, or is that like people who want to get into the business, into a job of an SRE?
It's actually companies that are partners who have SREs internally and I think sort of view it similarly to the way that you guys do, which is if we can create an open, so everybody has read the Google book, and the Google book is great, but having a place where you can meet other people who are trying to train SREs and provide your insight. So for example, one company that might be interested is a company called Wayfair that's a large Kubernetes shop. I think they may also be OpenShift users, but predominantly they're Kubernetes. They have an interest in it because they feel, I think, the same way you guys do, which is writing this ourselves from our own viewpoint is perhaps less valuable than having multiple viewpoints. So
absolutely.
And this specific example feels like they're pretty good with reading through PRs and can get a lot out of the process itself, right?
Yeah. And that's why I was going to reach out to them with this is not necessary. Like I wouldn't tell you about this if you weren't a guy who I know has been a developer for 20 years. But knowing that, you may want to be watching here.
That also might be a good question for Jeremy Eater, who, he dropped off.
I think Karsten was planning to discuss it with him as well, but I can also, to your point, I'll close the loop with Karsten, make sure he has. If he hasn't, I'll ask the question, because I think they would find it useful to watch it, but I also don't want them to. I want to do it in a way where we're able to greet them and pull them along. Other companies that have voiced interest in the past are similar, financial companies that run a lot of internal private stuff. And I think everybody has the same challenge: is how do you try and bring people on board as SREs with some level of understanding of what it is they're actually being asked to do.
Yeah, exactly. And that's really the core mission of the SIG SRE is we want to collect the information from all the teams inside Red Hat that are doing SRE work from every experience level, new teams, experienced teams, and condense it all, get the best practices or common practices better, and write it all down and share it out because, open source.
If there's one thing we don't have enough of, it's SREs.
It's true.
Yeah. Cool. That was my major one. So I'm gonna make a note to just close the loop before I send this to him. With Karsten, Jeremy's on board, or the Jeremy thinks it's a good idea.
Yeah, I know he's talked about the community building before. I just don't know where he thinks the timeline is for that specifically.
Yeah.
That might be if whatever Karsten thinks is best for that.
Yeah. That's cool. As I said, it occurred to me since you said you were involved in the community, getting additional perspective is always helpful about communities that I'm not intimately involved with.
Yep.
So cool. I didn't have any other specific questions. I really appreciate this, though. Christoph, do you know if it's been, was this taped?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh,
Well,
cool.
digital tape nowadays, right?
No, that
But yes.
I want to get the recording to share with some of the folks who are standing up the NERC, because I think we're in the middle of doing SLAs, and they think about SLOs all the time, but this was a way to help them focus on it.
Cool. Yeah, anytime.
So, awesome.
Cool.
Thank-
I'm pretty sure Marcel gonna send out all the stuff, or Lisa, you're gonna do it. I think he clicked the button, so he gonna receive the recording.
Yeah.
Let's see. So feels like we are good. Thanks for the SLO introduction. I'm super keen how that boils down to all the indicators we have or have not on the operate first environment right now. So let's see. Cool.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here, Michael, Lisa. See you later.
Take care.
Bye.